All right, this lecture will pick up at the second main question, dealing with Japanese actions with their expansion. And so the question is, what were the main aspects of the Second Sino-Japanese War from 1937 to 1941? And my rough thesis statement that I have here is that the Second Sino-Japanese War was a culmination of decades of Japanese imperialist policy, which had as its aim the domination of China and access to its food supplies, raw materials, and labor. So the road to war with China and Japan actually started with some pretty significant foreign policy changes by the Japanese. The first one that we want to talk about would be in 1937. We have Japan's new Prime Minister, Fumimaro. He's an expansionist prime minister, and he's convinced that Japan had to adopt a policy for its own autonomous bloc, which supported the idea of the Asiatic Monroe Doctrine. So if you remember back from U.S. history, the Monroe Doctrine was essentially the United States in 1823 saying to Europe that the Western Hemisphere, or North and South America, is the sphere of the United States, and any matters that dealt or that happened in the Western Hemisphere, the United States would take care of, and that Europe should stay out. Likewise, the United States would stay out of any European affairs. So when we talk about the Asiatic Monroe Doctrine, we're essentially saying that the Japanese wanted to have their own interests and their own autonomous bloc in the Pacific and in Asia, specifically mainland China. And we'll talk about this a little bit more in the third part of the lecture. But the United States, Great Britain, they did give a little bit of pushback here, and just like in the homework, we saw that the Japanese didn't see a difference between what they wanted to do and what the United States had done. They asked, how was this different than how the United States acted in Latin and Central America and in the Caribbean countries? They argued that the United States had frequently intervened to protect U.S. investments and ensure peace and stability, and the Japanese were arguing that they were doing the same thing. So the Japanese had declared, or proclaimed this Asiatic Monroe Doctrine in 1933 to the League of Nations, and they formally adopted it as a fundamental policy here with the new Prime Minister in 1937. The other thing that we want to focus on as far as foreign policy changes was that in 1936 there was a focus on the Soviet Union. We talked about this in class: the Strike North versus the Strike South faction, as far as Japanese military leaders go, and this was still being hammered out in 1936 as far as what direction the Japanese were going to go in, and to try to gain some help from the West. Japan signed this anti-Comintern pact with Nazi Germany in hopes that forcing Russia or forcing the Soviet Union to have to fight a two-pronged or have to face a two-pronged attack, with Japan coming in from the east and Germany coming in from the west. That doesn't really ever play out the way Japan had intended. Japan actually met some pretty stiff resistance by the Russians, and by the 1941, Japan and the Soviet Union will have signed a non-aggression pact, ending their conflict in East Asia. The start of the Sino-Japanese War, the Second Sino-Japanese War, happened on July 7th, 1937. The Japanese provoked a small clash with the Chinese outside of Beijing. It was over a pass known as the Marco Polo Bridge. The Chinese were blamed once again. This is a similar routine or pattern that we saw with Manchuria. But this is because, Japan's government had more hardliners in the army, and that these hardliners wanted more than a settlement along the lines maybe between 1931 and 1937. They wanted more divisions sent to China, and so we'll see here soon after, from in 1937, we'll see that more incidents are going to start to sprout up between the Chinese and Japanese near Shanghai. Eventually, what's going to happen is that the Chinese will launch a general mobilization here. We'll talk about it a little bit later. Zhang Yeshi finally decides to create or establish that Second United Front. We'll see some general mobilization by the Chinese, and Japan's response is that their government will declare an all-out war on the Chinese. And you see a lot of support for this action in Japan. Japan had been modernizing its forces since 1868, and China has been somewhat unified since 1927. So this really meant little resistance for Japan. By November of 1937, we saw that the Japanese had occupied the city of Shanghai. And by December of 1937, the Japanese captured the Chinese capital, Nanjing. In Nanjing, something that is worth mentioning is that the rape of Nanjing is one of the most notorious aspects of the early part of the Second Sino-Japanese War. The commanding Japanese general, Iwan, or Masui Iwane, made no attempt to control the behavior of his soldiers in the city, and a sense of that racial superiority that was an important part of the Japanese schooling system, that state nationalism we talked about, resulted in 200,000 Chinese civilians murdered. You see those three alls: burn all, kill all, loot all, happening in Nanjing. In the first month alone, it's estimated that 20,000 Chinese women are going to be raped. So it's pretty horrific as far as what's happening in Nanjing. After the capture of Nanjing, Japan was able to take control of most of China by the end of 1937. Zhang has retreated and established a wartime capital in Chongqing. It's located on the map if you look on the board. By 1938, we see over 1 million Japanese soldiers in China. Japan controlled all the main cities and all the lines of communications in the provinces around the Yangtze River. Once again, if you're looking at the map on the board, you'll be able to find that. This is important because these areas in the coastal region are the most fertile and densely populated areas in China. The same year, Japan's going to capture, cities that are farther down south. We're looking at around this area here, and that's pretty much where the Japanese aggression or invasion will end in China. We'll see over the next 5 years, Japan will try to get new ground and try to push into the interior, but with little to no success. That Second United Front, which joined the CCP and the GMD against the Japanese, they turned this war into a war of attrition that was fought in the mountains of China, and we'll see that the Japanese will gain very little ground there over the next 5 years. All right, moving on, we'll look at the third section here for Japanese actions, and the question is, why did Japan attack Pearl Harbor in 1941? Once again, looking at some foreign policy changes here that are important to note. February 1933, we saw the Japanese Monroe Doctrine announced, or the Asiatic Monroe Doctrine, and we also saw that there was increasing cooperation between those Abatsus and those militarists pursuing that expansionist policy. And the Zaibatsus that were linked to the military, they did this because that cooperation with the military gave them access to raw materials. It would allow them to establish greater monopolies in Japan. It allowed them to build up their profits. So it was very beneficial for both the Zaibatsus and the Japanese military to work together. In fact, the Zaibatsus were very active in investing Japanese capital into places like Manchuria and other areas that the Japanese had controlled for the increased war production. And by 1940, the Japanese businesses owned almost 85% of all capital investments in Manchuria, so they're really racking up a profit here. You can look at source B for your primary source break, and look at what that message is being conveyed there with the Asiatic Monroe Doctrine. So a couple of foreign policy changes that we see that would lead up to the attack on Pearl Harbor. Number one, the fundamental principles of national policy will be adopted in 1937. This does a couple things. Number one, the Japanese military still hasn't decided whether or not they're going to do the strike north and strike south. So they do have a stronger stance against the USSR. Remember, the year prior, they had just signed the Anti-Comintern Pact with the Germans. They also decide to advance into the South Sea region. And they want to establish what's called the Greater East Asia Coast Prosperity Sphere. Essentially, what that means is that the Japanese will expand into the Pacific. They label this as having Asia being ruled by Asians. They want to do this, and they want to expand and have this Greater East Asia Prosperity Sphere, even if it meant military conflicts with Great Britain and the United States. With this Greater East Asia Prosperity Sphere and this fundamental national policy, there's an emphasis placed on building up armed forces. There's an emphasis placed on trying to conclude the war with China, and there's an emphasis on trying to, is eventually move into areas where Japan can have access to those raw materials. Another foreign policy change that's worth noting here is that the Tripartite Pact was signed in September of 1940. This is known as the Three Power Pact or the Berlin Pact. This was signed between Germany, Italy, and Japan. Confirmed that the three countries' intentions were to establish new orders in their respective regions. This is essentially like a military alliance, a warning to the United States that if one of the countries were attacked, the other two would assist that country. It's trying to have a deterrent for the United States, to get involved in either war, because at this time conflicts and tension were growing in the Pacific, and World War II in Europe is raging on, and the United States is slowly but surely starting to get economically involved in aiding Great Britain in their war against Nazi Germany. But the Tripartite Pact, even though it's it's signed, it's an agreement, the three powers didn't work very closely together, and we really see that these are two separate wars that are going on. So the attack on Indochina and Pearl Harbor, a couple of developments here. When World War II begins in Europe in 1939, Japan has really three options here. One, we talked about striking north against the USSR. You could go south against the European allies. This would be the Netherlands, Great Britain, France, or you can go east and get to the United States. Really, what they want is they want to move into somewhere where they can get access to raw materials. This will set up Japan to try to decide what their next options were. What happens here is that in June of 1940, France is defeated by Germany, and so in a couple months later, in September of 1940, we see a small force move into French Indochina. They said that the Japanese said that this was part of the Second Sino-Japanese War. They said that it was aimed at stopping the nationalist government of China from importing arms and fuel through French Indochina. They said that they asked the French to do this, but that request was refused. This is really an attempt by the Japanese. Most people see this as an attempt by the Japanese to get access to the pivotal raw materials that they need to continue to fight these wars. The United States will respond to this move by imposing economic sanctions against Japan. This has reduced the exports of oil, iron, and other machinery. The United States also made it clear that further Japanese aggression in the region would result in much tougher sanctions. By April of 1941, we will see that the Japanese and Soviets will have kind of, dealt with their problems.